going to start. Thank you. And the one thing I'd like to say, and it's going to be on the source sheet that I share, I'd like this year to be in memory of my neighbor's daughter, 23 years old, Rinat Zagdon, Rinat Bat Macholan Moriel. She was at the party in Kibbutz Re'im and was murdered Simchas Torah morning. The family is getting up from Shiva today, and I can't think of a more fitting way to commemorate the end of the Shiva and her loss than learning Torah in her memory by a group of women committed to learning Torah. So may her memory be a blessing to her family and to all of Am Yisrael. We are going to start, so where we're just to kind of first class we're having since last June, just to pull everyone back in. We had last year, we really started with Shimon HaTzadik as the last representative of Anshe Knesset Hagdola around 300 BCE. And we ended in the 1st century CE after the destruction of the temple. And we really focused at the end on the building of Yavne, or the rebuilding of Torah outside of the world of Jerusalem, that moment where Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai kind of takes the reins of leadership and says, okay, Jerusalem is going to have to fall, and we're going to have to continue and rebuild somewhere else before even thinking of going back to Jerusalem. And we saw the emergence of Yavne, and a lot of the challenges at the end of the Second Temple with corruption, with power dynamics, with rabbinic authority being essentially flawed and challenged and so on. And we move towards the rebuilding and the challenges of rebuilding. And what we're going to be starting with, we're continuing with Benny Lau's magnificent series, really. The Sages were in volume 2, chapter 12. And we're going to continue working from there. And as I said to Sue, my feeling is we're going to get through book 2 and probably most of book 3. And there are 5 books. And this has been a wonderful framework for our learning and for discussions and for history and for rabbinic storytelling. So today we're picking up with Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes. And Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes, on one hand, is a bit of an obscure character. On the other hand, we have looked at a significant story with Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes both last year and in other classes I've given, because Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes is one of the foils in the showdown between Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua. We're going to see that source very quickly. Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes appears there and almost encourages Rabbi Yoshua to disagree with Rabban Gamliel's authority, and he plays a significant role in the Yom Kippur story. Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes appears in sources that are less familiar. He appears in Masechet Eduyot 12 times in like 6 Mishnahs as disagreeing with the sages on topics having to do with purity and impurity, right? So he is a player. By the time we get to Yavne, he's a very old man, and he really represents the world that no longer exists. And one of the questions that's going to come into sharp relief is, how does the new world look at the old world? And are they perhaps a little too quick to dismiss what is to their mind old and no longer relevant? And I'm also going to give enormous credit to a colleague, a friend, someone I've known since he's in college, Dr. Moshe Simon Shoshan, who's a professor at Bar Ilan University. He is a scholar of rabbinic stories, particularly in the Mishnah, and then this one's in the Talmud. And what he did here was he took a story that has not really been analyzed by academics. And he said, look, a lot of academics are interested in what we call the Yavne cycle of stories. And those stories we have all studied. It's the Rabbi Yoshua, Rabban Gamliel showdown. It's the Tanur of Achnai, the oven of Achnai. We're going to look at both of those very quickly. And there's a third story with Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who kind of replaces Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who ends up replacing Rabban Gamliel temporarily and then shares the leadership with Rabban Gamliel. And all of those are meant to highlight the brilliance of the sages and the wonderful both resilience and progressive thinking of the sages in saving the world of Torah. Go Yavna, yay Yavna. But what Moshe Simon Shoshan shows is this story really stands in contrast to the Yavna cycle and shows a sharp critique of the sages. Now, I'm going to pause. A lot of the stories show critique of sages. In fact, there are almost no stories that valorize the sages or the word create apologetica, right? All of the Talmudic stories, and it's why I love Talmudic stories and rabbinic stories, are deeply aware of how complex the relationships are between the rabbis and the priests, between the rabbis and the rabbis, between the rabbis and the women, between the rabbis and their children, right? The stories are wonderful precisely because of the complexity and the critique embedded within them. But I agree that often the Yavna stories, the Yavna cycle of stories, particularly the Avin of Achnai, are meant to show the brilliance and the resilience of the scholars in following Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's lead towards Yavna, towards what has to be done, towards packing, to quote Rabbi Rabbi Eliezer Berkowitz, the suitcase for exile. And so I think we can hold both the tremendous admiration, it's what I've been doing in the many years I've been studying and teaching, tremendous admiration and critique, because both are legitimate when we try to wrestle with what was, what led to what is, right? That intersection of past, present, and future, and that moment that we look at a story and we recognize both the complexity of what went into the story, the impact it has had on our lives thousands of years later, and the relevance, because often many of the themes are deeply relevant to our own lives, and that is going to emerge as well in this story, or this character, this personality that we are going to be looking at. Okay, so good morning to everyone. Thank you to everyone who has joined. I'm going to share my screen right now. I know they sent out the source sheet as well, so however you like to follow. Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes, right, in the manner of Rabbi Lau's book, he often cites the teaching from Masechet Avot, which tells us that we're still dealing with the Tanaim. We're still very much in the Tanaitic period. We're going to see that shortly when we see the main characters who appear in the story. Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes Omer, Sheina shel Shacharit, V'yayin shel Tzaharayim, V'sichat haYiladim, V'yeshivat batei knesiyot shel amei haaretz, Motzi'in et ha'adam min ha'olam. So let's look at the translation. Rabbi Dosa ben Horkenes said, morning sleep, midday wine, the prattle of children, children's talk, and sitting. Now it's interesting, Batei Knesset here is not meant to be the synagogue, but the Batei Kinus, where people gather, the assembly of ignorant, Motziim et ha'adam min ha'olam, put a man out of the world. I'm not going to go into this right now. I want to go back and look at it after we get to know a little more about Rabbi Dosa, and then I'd like to be thoughtful about at what point in his life might he be teaching this teaching. Okay. We are now going to look at, before we dive into the main story, which is really a brilliant example of rabbinic storytelling, we need to look at some of the Yavna cycle stories. And we're going to look at this story, as I said, very, very quickly. We've seen it before. I think I might have even brought it before Yom Kippur this year. We have the classic story of Rabban Gamliel with the witnesses, right? Rabban Gamliel, who accepts witnesses every month to testify to the sighting of the new moon in order to declare Rosh Chodesh. And that is the way in which the month is declared, and it's something that's given to the people. Wonderful. And he has a diagram in his attic with pictures of different shapes of the moon. and so on. And so in this Mishnah, Rosh Hashanah, Mishnayot Chet and Ted, we have an example where witnesses come, and in the first, and Rabban Gamliel accepts them, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri says they're false witnesses, that this can't be. And when they arrive in Yavne, Rabban Gamliel accepts them, right? So the tension, the power struggle, right? A lot of the stories deal with hierarchy of power, power struggles. What is power going to look like? What is leadership going to look like? These are complex questions we continue to ask today. Rabban Gamliel, who is wealthy, who is educated, right, has taken up the reins of power. He's a descendant of Hillel, and it's a natural place for him to be. He has connections with the Romans, and yet, in order to be a leader, you have to make decisions that are imposed on the majority. And here Rabban Gamliel has created the framework for accepting the witnesses. And there are questions that arise about the integrity of the process. Okay, there's another story, same Mishnah. Two witnesses come, we saw the moon, and so on and so forth. Rabban Gamliel accepts them. And in this case, we saw the new moon and so on, and yet at night it was not seen. And Rabban Gamliel accepted them. And Rabbi Dosa ben Horkinus, this is why Rabbi Dosa disagrees. We're still talking about the end of Bayit Sheni, let's say, right? Maybe really we're still very much focused on the new moon and the witnesses. And he says they are false witnesses. How can witnesses testify that a woman gives birth and the next day her belly is between her teeth? I would actually reframe that. This has to be after the destruction, because we're going to see Rabbi Akiva appears, and Rabbi Akiva is after the destruction. So it's in that first years after the destruction. So Rabbi Dosa disagrees with Rabban Gamliel, and that leads to Rabbi Yoshua saying, I see the logic of your statement. Now let's pay attention to the players. We have Rabban Gamliel, we have Rabbi Dosa ben Horkinus, we have Rabbi Yoshua. Rabban Gamliel, now the decree, right, this very, very harsh decree sentencing Rabbi Yoshua to conform to his authority, to accept his authority and come on the Yom Kippur that Rabbi Yoshua thinks is Yom Kippur based on his calculations. Rabbi Akiva shows up, right? Rabbi Akiva is going to show up in our story today as well. So we have Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Akiva, really the stars of Yavne. Rabbi Gamliel and Rabbi Yoshua are in a somewhat of a power struggle, or a struggle for rabbinic authority, or actually I'm going to say Rabbi Gamliel is somewhat concerned that Rabbi Yoshua accept his authority. Even if Rabbi Yoshua is quietly dissenting in the Beit Midrash, that can threaten the whole structure. We've talked about this before, why Rabbi Gamliel behaves the way he does. And Rabbi Akiva shows up, and he finds Rabbi Yoshua distressed, and a dialogue unfolds between Rabbi Yoshua and first Rabbi Akiva. Not enough, right? They come to some sort of agreement why Rabbi Gamliel is correct. And then he goes to Rabbi Dosa ben Horkinus. In other words, what's interesting here is the dialogue between Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Akiva. And I've argued in previous classes that I think Rabbi Yoshua is the one articulating the argument rather than Rabbi Akiva convincing him of the argument. Doesn't matter. Rabbi Dosa ben Horkinus needs to be the person Rabbi Yoshua consults with, because at the beginning of the whole story, it's Rabbi Dosa who convinced Rabbi Yoshua to question. He doesn't convince him because he says you should question, but his critique of Rabban Gamliel is what allows Rabbi Yoshua to pause and say, wait, I agree with you. And now he goes back to Rabbi Dosa, and in that conversation, Rabbi Dosa clearly supports his accepting Rabban Gamliel. Okay, so I just wanted to remind us a famous story where we've seen Rabbi Dosa ben Horkinus before. It's an important story. Rabbi Dosa, on one hand, is a minor player. He doesn't go directly up against Rabban Gamliel, but he is part of these ebbs and flows, these shifts, this questioning of who has authority, who has rabbinic leadership in the academy, what is it based on? And so Rabbi Dosa, in the first part of the story, questions the integrity of Rabban Gamliel's decision-making. It has a cascade effect over to Rabbi Yoshua. And in the end, Rabbi Yoshua goes back to Rabbi Dosa, and the two of them together recognize, or Rabbi Dosa encourages Rabbi Yoshua to recognize that he must accept Rabbi Gamliel's authority. Okay, that's story number one. Anyone have a comment or a question before we move on to the next story? Okay, so I'm going to assume we're all okay. I'm now in Baba Metzia. This is the story of Avin Avachnai. It's possible we'll go back. I think I actually did teach this last year as part of the early Yavna cycle, but if not, we've all learned it before. What's interesting about the Tanur of Achnai is that often the focus is on Rabbi Yoshua. Here we are, Rabbi Yoshua again, standing up and saying, Lo b'shamayim, it is not in heaven. And we all clap our hands. Oh, thank you, Rabbi Yoshua, for explaining to us why the rabbinic authority, why rabbinic Judaism, why the rabbinic framework is a justified, legitimate, and even offshoot of divine framework for us to follow, right? Lo b'shamayim hi. And that's really in the middle. It's the center of the story. And only, I would say, in the last 10, 15 years has Professor Jeffrey Rubenstein come along and say, wait a minute, let's look at the entire story, at what comes before the story and how the story ends, in order to understand that even here, there's a critique, right? So I'm going to bring this because this is this really epitomizes the heroism of rabbinic authority, of what the rabbis are doing in Yavna. And even here, we zoom out a little, we recognize that it comes with a price, that there's consequence. Okay. So Baba Metzia, there's a Mishnah that talks about ona'at dvarim, the idea of verbal wronging, right? And so the Mishnah starts off by telling us that verbal wronging is an affront to God, right? Okay, I'm not going into that. It's a pasuk from Vayikra. And here the Gemara says, Tanu Rabbanan, lo tonu isha tamito ba'ona'at dvarim, and so on and so forth. You should not wrong one another with verbal wrongs. And what I didn't bring is a citation, I believe it's by Rav Chisda, who says the gates are always open to those who are verbally wronged, okay? To those who are offended verbally. Now we get the story. We have the famous story of the Avin of Achnai. As I've often said, it's almost like, why are they making a big deal about this? Like, who really cares? It's about purity and impurity. It's about an oven. It's about tiles of an oven and how they're cut and placed, whether they acquire impurity or not. Certainly by the time we're in Yavne, certainly post-temple, it's intellectually interesting, but we don't have a temple anymore. We're maybe still trying to hold on to the world of purity and impurity, but mostly it affected the priests anyway. So in Yavne, right, how many people are being affected by this? And yet this becomes the turning point in the Beit Midrash around how decision-making takes place in the world of the rabbis. And so what we have here is Rabbi Eliezer declaring it clean or pure, the sages declaring it impure, okay, right? And so this is the monumental argument. We're not focusing on this story. It really is just to get us to our story. And what I want to point out here, there's actually a line here that I think is very important because it's going to reappear in our story in a slightly different way. Why was it called the Tanur of Achnai? Was it an oven that belonged to Achnai? Or is there something more insidious? Achnai is a serpent, and Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, Amoraim already, next generation. They circle him, they encompass Hikifo Dvarim Ka'achnai. They really encompass him, Hikifo. They encompass the case study, but really what I see is the serpent circling Rabbi Eliezer with arguments. In other words, on this day, Rabbi Eliezer is not going to get off scot-free. On this day, Rabbi Eliezer is not going to be winning any arguments. They're bringing every argument, every dialectical argument, every exegesis, all of the arsenal they have, and they encompass him and they circle him. And we know, of course, that what a serpent does is it suffocates its prey, right? It silences its prey. So what happens here is on that day, Rabbi Eliezer brings forth every imaginable argument. They don't accept it. And we have the story with the carob tree and the stream of water and the schoolhouse, the walls of the schoolhouse, and so on and so forth. And we know that everything Rabbi Eliezer throws back, every weapon he lobs at them, they throw back at him. They're just not interested. I would say even more than that, they don't even engage. In some ways, it's even worse. They just put up a wall. Like, yeah, we're not interested in dialogue. We've already encircled you, entrapped you with our arguments, and we're not interested in listening. And what I've said is, in some ways, that's even crueler. This is Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes, right? We've studied him in the past, and he's very connected. He's a bor seed shaloma abed tipa. He's a plastered cistern that doesn't lose one drop of water. He holds on to tradition tightly. He's not interested in innovation. He's not interested in finding new interpretations. He really represents a world that was. We've talked about that. It seems likely he's a Shammaiist rather than someone from Beit Hillel, right?
Can I just quickly interrupt? For those people who don't know, maybe you could just quickly summarize what the specific argument was with the ovens.
Yeah, sure. The specific argument is ovens were made of clay and layers of sand. Now, an object that is considered to be a seamless clay object acquires impurity. No one argues about that. If I have a pot made of ceramic, that acquires impurity. And an oven is what's a kli, it's a utensil. So in theory, an oven that's made out of ceramic should acquire impurity as well. How would it acquire impurity? If a rat climbed into it and died. Okay, just like, again, climbs into my pot, climbs into my oven, and it dies. Now it's clear if it climbs into my pot and dies, I have to break the pot. It's the only way I can purify it. Basically, you have to destroy it. The question with the oven of Achnai is that it's made up of a layer of ceramic and a layer of sand, and a layer of ceramic and a layer of sand. And the argument is as follows. Do I look at it as a unified or uniform ceramic utensil? And the clay is just there to strengthen the ceramic, or does the sand, or does the sand break the consecutive nature of the ceramic, so it's not really a ceramic utensil, and sand is not makabel tuma, is not subject to impurity. So does the sand, in some ways, the layers of sand in between the ceramic, save the oven from impurity? Or do we ignore it and say, no, it's a ceramic utensil and it's subject to impurity? That's the argument. Rabbi Eliezer basically says the sand breaks the ceramicness. And as a result, it's not a uniform ceramic utensil. Whereas the sages say, no, it's a ceramic utensil. Like, who cares if there's sand there? Okay, is that helpful?
Thank you.
That's why I had said it's not a very interesting argument. I mean, to me, it's not a particularly interesting argument. People who love the laws of purity and impurity find this, of course, this kind of thing fascinating. I try to get through that material to get to like what's really interesting about the sugya. But that's the argument. Okay, does this oven incur impurity or not? Anything else you want to know about the story? Hopefully, again, it's somewhat familiar. I'm skipping the story. I just want to get to the main points of what happens. So what happens here, first of all, please remember they encompass him with arguments. Whenever you encompass someone with arguments, it's not going to go well. It usually means you don't want to listen. I'll just pause to say, right, even today, we know part of what makes it difficult to talk to people who disagree with us is that we come with our arsenal of arguments and we like throw them at the person and we're not really interested in listening, right? Like that's one of the big issues in terms of people dialoguing today. And here, what we're seeing a picture of is the rabbis essentially on this day, after this argument, decide enough is enough. We're not interested in Rabbi Eliezer's continuously disagreeing with us. It's time to put a stop to this. Now, we don't really, as readers of the story, understand why this argument is what sets the whole thing into motion. We don't. As Jeffrey Rubenstein did a really brilliant analysis and piecing together of how this story came together, the different pieces that were pulled in from other parts of the Talmud. It's really I think the first we're talking about 20 years ago, but the first time I really encountered literary analysis of a story and looking at how rabbinic stories are told and pulled together. And so I'm going to refer to him, and it's in a book called Talmudic Stories, and it's really quite wonderful. But the crux of it is that Rabbi Eliezer, for many reasons, represents a threat in Yavne. He refuses to go along with the party line. And while this story is an innocuous story, so it seems, or this argument seems to be an innocuous argument, it's the straw that breaks the camel's back. They've had enough. And this day they come armed for essentially for a battle, right? Even that language of encircling him, encompassing him like a serpent, he's their prey, right? And because it's the sages, they're going to win. He doesn't really stand a chance. We as readers from the very beginning are meant to understand he can't win this battle, and how painful that must be for him, and how frustrating. And the story continues, right? He calls on the carob tree to move, and the carob tree moves, and the stream of water flows backwards, and he gets the walls of the schoolhouse to begin to collapse. And Rabbi Yoshua stands up and says, "What are you doing? This is an argument between sages. It's not for you to intervene." And then Rabbi Eliezer says, Bat Kol, divine voice, agree with me. And the Bat Kol comes out and says, what can I do? The truth is with Rabbi Eliezer. And that's when Rabbi Yoshua stands on his feet and says, you gave us the Torah, lo b'shamayim hi, it is not in heaven, right? And he quotes all sorts of verses. And we have God laughing and saying, nitzchuni banai, my sons have defeated me, my sons have defeated me, right? Like, wow, it's that moment in Yavne where it seems like now we get it. That moment that the sages and God are in partnership, and that God is delighted by the ownership the sages have taken of Torah, to the point that even if there were divine truth, if we could establish divine truth, if the Bat Kol came out and the majority of sages said, I'm sorry, we're going in a different direction, we have gained complete ownership over Torah out of love for Torah, respect for Torah, passion for Torah, desire to save Torah, whatever you want to say, right? So that's what's happening in the story. I want to get to the next part. Again, I'm bringing this story and the story with Yom Kippur as the contrast to the Rabbi Dosa story we're about to get to, but it's important because stories often not just borrow from one another, but they're aware of one another. And I think there are going to be at least two moments in the Rabbi Dosa story that show an awareness of the Avin of Achnai story. Okay, everyone with me? Okay, I'm going to assume yes, and I appreciate whoever stopped to ask. Hi, Donna. Oh, you're on Rivka Yakobov's Zoom. That's why it was a little confusing. Okay, let me share my screen. Back to our story. So then, and I'll tell you, this is where the story takes a dark turn. I would say often when the story used to be taught, certainly when the dark side of rabbinic stories was smoothed over. These stories are amazing because they don't really smooth over the darker sides of human nature of the rabbis. What do? They take all the objects that Rabbi Eliezer declared clean and they burn them, and they vote to excommunicate him, and he's not there, right? I said, you feel like it's an ir nidachat moment, a moment of what is described in the Torah you do to a city that has been condemned and excommunicated for idolatry. You burn everything. They burn every object he has declared clean. Like, what is that? It's so violent, right? It's so absolute. And then they're like, okay, someone has to go tell him. Who's going to go tell him? Because he's not in the Beit Midrash that day. They do it on a day where he's not there. I just want to show the language because this is going to be relevant in our story. Mi yelech v'yodiu. That's going to come up in our story, that language. Who's going to go tell him? And who is it? We all know he's our hero in a lot of these stories. It's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the one who has the moral compass, the anchor, the sensitivity. He's going to go tell him. And the irony, Rabbi Akiva's world of interpretation is what is replacing Rabbi Eliezer's. Okay, so we're sending the person no, I should even say, the person who volunteers is the person who is most acutely aware of why Rabbi Eliezer has to be excommunicated, because Rabbi Eliezer refuses to get with the program, and the program is now being led or curated by Rabbi Akiva's school of Midrash, halachic Midrash and halachic Midrash. And so Rabbi Akiva, and I've used this. I used this in a session I did on art and rabbinic text. It was about mourning, about death. Rabbi Akiva puts on black garments and he sits 4 cubits and he cries, right? Rabbi Akiva's sensitivity is that he goes and he shows that he is bereft over what is being done to Rabbi Eliezer, and he recognizes the loss in the world of Torah over Rabbi Eliezer's Torah, that Rabbi Eliezer's inflexibility, Rabbi Eliezer's need to be excommunicated, or the Beit Midrash's need to excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer. It is Rabbi Akiva who recognizes acutely what this loss is, and that's why he's the one who goes to inform him, and he cries and he tears his clothing and they sit together. It really is quite a beautiful moment. I think a very powerful moment, how we approach someone who is in pain. And Rabbi Akiva just sits with him on the ground, wearing black, crying, and just feeling his pain. It's a powerful moment. So, and then the story continues, and we have the story of Rabban Gamliel, and so on and so forth. And the end of the story, back to the new moon, right? It's not linking to the Yom Kippur story. This happens on Rosh Chodesh, and Rabbi Eliezer falls on his face and cries out to God for all the insult and injury that's been done to him. And his wife says, "Get up, you've killed my brother." And in fact, the word goes out that Rabbi Gamliel has died, because the gates of heaven are always open to those who have been verbally wronged. And it's Rabban Gamliel's Beit Midrash, even though Rabban Gamliel wasn't involved in the story, that excommunicated him, right? So there's a lot going on in that story. It's a fascinating literary structure. My point is that the players we have here are Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva, right? They're all familiar to us. They are the sages of Yavne. Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus is being excommunicated. He's being excommunicated in a way that they encircle him with arguments, and they refuse to let him break through this encirclement, this encampment they've surrounded him with, and someone has to go inform him. Those are the 2 things I want you to remember, because they're going to play out in our story. Okay, any comments or questions? So we've looked at the Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Gamliel, Dosa ben Horkinus combination, the story where Rabbi Yoshua is on the verge essentially of being to some degree excommunicated if he does not actively come back in and accept Rabban Gamliel's authority. We have a story where Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkinus refuses to submit to the sage's authority in Yavne because he feels he has the truth. He's excommunicated, right? Rabbi Akiva is a player in both of those stories, in being with the person who is in that conflict. Do I submit? Don't I submit? Right? And now we're moving on to the story that I want to focus on, which is, can someone remind me, this class is till 10:10 or 10:15? Anyone know?
Supposedly till 10:10, but as much as you need.
Okay. So we're going to start. I did not have a chance to bring the translation of the Mishnah. When I rework the sources, I will. But again, what I'm about to, we are now moving to Masechet Yevamot. Okay, we are now moving to a story that has not been fully analyzed. And as I'm very grateful, this article just came out in 2022, spring 2022. So it's a relatively new article in the Jewish Quarterly Review. I found it online. Yeah, I can send the link. Have them send you the link. And this story has not fully been examined, and we're going to be looking at it carefully. The backdrop to the story is around the following argument between Shammai and Hillel, Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. If a man's brother is married to someone who is incestuous for the man, it can be his half-sister, that is not his brother's half-sister, right? There are all sorts of, his aunt, but it's not his brother's aunt, right? They might have different fathers, different mothers. So his brother has 2 wives, one of whom is forbidden to him because of incest. Okay, that's the machloket. You've probably heard of it, right? So we can even go to the obvious. His brother is married to his daughter, which is a completely permitted. An uncle is allowed to marry a niece. So his brother married, we'll do Avram and Yitzchak. Avram has a daughter named Sarah. Make it even more, right? Avram has a daughter named Sarah. Sarah marries his brother Yitzchak. And Yitzchak took another wife, Rivka, who's not related to anybody. In theory, Avram could marry Rivka on any day, but his brother Yitzchak married her. We also know that you're not normally allowed to marry your brother's widow, your brother's ex-wife. You're not allowed to, unless your brother dies without children. And then suddenly there's a mitzvah of yibum. Okay, so the machloket, and I'll check in a minute to make sure we're all following. I'm just hoping this is more of a review than anything that's new. The machloket is the rival wife, what's called the tzara, when one wife is fundamentally prohibited, is the rival wife permitted through yibum? In other words, if Avram's daughter Sarah married his brother Yitzchak, and Yitzchak dies without children, is Avram permitted to do yibum with the second wife, Rivka, even though one of the wives was forever prohibited to him because of incest? Okay, that's a machloket. And for those who have studied Masechet Yevamot, what you probably remember is that when one of the wives is absolutely prohibited to the brother, then the other wife goes free without yibum, without chalitza, without anything. Like the whole bond dissolves. Okay, that is the approach of Beit Hillel. Okay, Beit Shammai matirim hatzarot lachim. Beit Shammai comes along and says, "What do I care that Sarah is Avram's daughter? There's another wife. The man died without children. Rivka and Avram should do yibum, or at the very least chalitza, because there's a bond there." Okay, and Beit Shammai says they're permitted. Sarah is not permitted because she's his daughter, but there's Rivka. And Rivka is a perfectly excellent example of for yibum. And Beit Hillel says, Osrin, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You can't. Once one of them is fundamentally prohibited through incest, the other one gets a lucky break, if you will, and can now marry whoever she wants. And of course, the caveat is that according to Beit Shammai, either yibum or chalitza, but if you do chalitza, you can't marry a Kohen, right? So Rivka is now in this special situation where either Avram does yibum with her or Avram does chalitza. If he does chalitza, Rivka now has to walk around like a divorcee and say, are you a Kohen? Are you a Kohen? In order to remarry, okay? So Beit Shammai poslin min hakuna and Beit Hillel machshirim, right? Okay, classic. Beit Shammai says, if she does chalitza, she's puzzles like a divorcee. And Beit Hillel says if she does chalitza, it's nothing. Like they shouldn't have done chalitza. She never had to do chalitza. She's kosher. She's a widow. She's allowed to marry a Kohen. Nityabmu. What if Avram does yibum with Rivka? Beit Shammai says amazing. It's kosher. The children are kosher. And Beit Hillel says no. That was a prohibited relationship. There's a puzzle, a psul. There's a flaw in those children. Okay, so I'm going to review in a minute. Let me just get to the end of the Mishnah. Hopefully you're still with me. This is very, very classic. Afal pi she'elu osrim ve'elu matirim, even though these prohibit the co-wives, the rival wives, and these permit. Elu poslin ve'elu machshirim. This school says these children have a psul. This school says these children have a psul, have a flaw. Lo nimneu Beit Shammai milisan nashimi Beit Hillel. Beit Shammai continued to marry women from the school of Beit Hillel. Beit Hillel from Beit Shammai. Wonder, right? That even though they had this argument, this really fundamental argument, they continued to marry from within the families of one another. Kol tarot vatmeot shayu elu mitarim ve'elu mitamin lo nimneu osin tarot elu al gabe elu. Now, this really ties us back to Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Even though there were fundamental disagreements about what is tameh, what is tahor, when do things become tameh, when do things not become tameh, they accepted, right? They didn't they didn't avoid osim tarot elo al gabe elo, using the vessels, the utensils, whatever the materials were that each one considered impure, as opposed to our story, where they take out everything Eliezer ben Hyrcanus ruled clean and burned it. This Mishnah presents a different reality where Beit Shammai, now it might be romanticizing, it might be a little idyllic, but the Mishnah at least presents, they might have argued dialectically, but in practice, they accepted the rulings of the other, right? That obviously shifts in Yavne, where they can't accept Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus's rulings, right? They excommunicate him as a shamuti, he's called, as a shamayist. He's essentially going to be ejected. No longer are we going to have this, dare I call it a pluralism, where your objects are tahor and your objects are tahor. No, if we fundamentally disagree, we cannot coexist. Okay, that's going to be what happens in the Tanur of Achnai. Just to review the rival wives, this is important for our story. Beit Shammai basically says, even if one of the wives is fundamentally prohibited, she's the daughter of one of the brothers, the other wife is permitted not only permitted, is required to do yibum or chalitza. Beit Hillel comes along and says, if one of the wives is fundamentally prohibited because it's an incestuous relationship, the other wife goes free. Not only that, if one of the brothers is the father, then I think none of the other brothers can marry her either, right? Like if there's this incestuous relationship after the brother dies with one of the brothers, the whole yibum thing falls apart. And Beit Shammai says, no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. If there's a second wife, she must do yibum or chalitza. And then what happens to the offspring? Yes.
Well, just a short question. If there are two wives and both of them are permitted, there's no what do you call it? There's no, incestuous relationship or anything like that, then who do they do yibum with?
Yeah. So then what happens is a brother decides, which if does, again, let's say Sarah and Rivka are not related to anyone, they're two strangers and so on, then Avram can decide who he wants to do yibum with.
Oh,
Now he
okay.
might go to Sarah and Sarah will say, I really don't want to do yibum with you. Can you ask Rivka, right? Like the women aren't completely passive. I mean, in some ways they're completely passive, but in other ways, it could be negotiated. It could be negotiated.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anyone else? So let's go back to our story. Okay, now we're almost at the story, but one more thing. So now Tashma, you'll remember I taught this last year when we talked about Rabbi Tarfon. Dama Rabbi Tarfon Te'evani, my tai tavot sarat tabat liyadi v'asa'ena, ema v'asa'ena. So, sorry, before we get to that, come and hear a different proof. They asked Rabbi Yoshua, right? Here's Rabbi Yoshua. He's going to be in our story as well. What is the halacha regarding the rival wife of a daughter? He said, by the way, that's the most common scenario. It's very hard to imagine a scenario where one brother's mother married another brother and that would be permitted. You'd really have, like, because a brother's not allowed to marry his father's wife, even if it's not his mother, right? Like, most of the incestuous relationships are never going to work out for a brother either. So it's just not going to happen. The daughter can happen. It's a niece. And that, and we know historically, uncles would marry, we know Nechama married her uncle, right? That was a permitted relationship. And I would say either because they loved each other, they had an intimacy out of familiarity, or for protection, right? Like he would marry his niece to give her a home and take care of her, Mordechai and Esther. So Rabbi Yoshua, that's why we're focusing on the daughter. What about the rival wife of a daughter? What does Rabbi Yoshua say? It's a dispute between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. In accordance with whose statement is the halacha? He said to them, I'm in the English, why are you inserting my head between two great mountains? These mountains are going to break my skull. However, I shall testify about two great families in Jerusalem, the Beit Zvoim, who came from Beit Achmai, and the Beit Kophai family from the town of Beit Mechoshesh. They were descendants of rival wives who married others, according to Beit Hillel, and from them came high priests. Okay, so basically when Rabbi Yoshua is asked in the Yavne era, what do we do with this machloket? We have to resolve it. We have to come to resolution. It's very nice. The Mishnah says the families kept marrying each other, but by Yavne, we need a decision. We can't live with this uncertainty. He says, look, I really don't want to choose a side. They're both great mountains, but I know there were two families that they acted according to Beit Hillel. They permitted the rival wives to go free and marry whoever they wanted. And those rival wives who were let free without Yibum ended up having children who became Kohen Gadol. Okay. We then have Rabbi Tarfon who says, wow, it's a very bizarre statement. Rabbi Tarfon basically says, I await the day when the rival wife of my daughter comes before me for Yibum, which is like, that would mean your brother would have to die, leaving your daughter a widow, but okay. But it shows that Rabbi Tarfon was a Shammaiist, that he's ruling like Shammai. Then we have a story, Maaseh b'bito shel Rabban Gamliel, shayta nisua la'aba achiv. Rabban Gamliel's daughter married his brother Abba, umet below banim, and Rabban Gamliel died without children. Here I only have the Hebrew. V'yibem Rabban Gamliel at Sarata, Rabban Gamliel did Yibum, like Shammai. V'tizbara Rabban Gamliel mi talmidei Beit Shammayu. Can Rabban Gamliel be from the students of Beit Shammai? But Rabban Gamliel is a descendant of Hillel. Elashani b'tosha Rabban Gamliel da'ilo nitave. That's a problem. To suggest that Rabban Gamliel, a descendant of Hillel, is ruling like Shammai, that doesn't make sense. It must be his daughter was sterile. She was barren. And so there's a whole question whether if you marry an Ilonit, it's full-on Kiddushin or not. So he married her to his brother, but the real wife was the fertile wife. Again, they're trying to twist themselves into a little bit of a pretzel. In order, on one hand, we're seeing that there were people who thought Beit Shammai was correct, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabban Gamliel, who married the rival wife of his daughter. On the other hand, it's very not clear what the halacha, the halacha is still being disputed. And then we have Rabbi Yoshua who says, well, I know about these two families that acted like Beit Hillel. The sons became Kohanim Gedolim. That must be the halacha. Okay, that's the backdrop. Now we're ready for our story. Tashma, Bimei Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus Hutra Sarat Habat La'achim. Shma Mina Asu Shma Mina. Okay. Come in here. In the time of Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus lived at the end of the Bayit Sheni into the post-Bayit Sheni period. He's going to be a very old man by the time we meet him. And in his time, Hutrat Sarat Habat La'achim, the rival wife of a daughter, was permitted to the brothers. Shma Mina, Asu, Shma Mina. Yeah, let's conclude. And now I've divided this according to Moshe Shoshan's division. This is not into acts. There are 3 acts to this story. And we're going to begin to look at the acts. Gufa. Gufa, as a word, takes me back to something that's already been stated. And it means the Gemara is going to relook at that statement and continue on from there. Bimei Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus, he tirut sarat habat la'achim, right? In the days of Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus, they permitted the rival wife of a daughter to the brothers. Va'aya hadavar kasheh l'chachamim. And this was very difficult. Now, first of all, just pay attention that it doesn't say that Rabbi Dosa ben Hyrcanus ruled that way, right? We're told that that was the law in the day of Bimei Dosa ben Hyrcanus, right? That they permitted, but anonymously, they permitted the daughter's co-wife to the brothers. Va'aya hadavar kasheh l'chachamim mibnei shechacham gadol haya, because he was a great sage. Oh, this is beginning to sound a little bit like Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. We have a great sage who seems to be following Beit Shammai in contradiction to the world of the sages in Yavne, which has clearly established the law like Beit Hillel. So that's point 1. Law should follow Beit Hillel. We're being drawn into a story with the certainty that the sages must confront this challenge and act to neutralize it. And now we're going to find out ve'enav kamo, and his eyes are weak, his eyes are fixed, milavo lebeit midrash, and they prevented him from coming to the Beit Midrash. So we have a situation where Rabbi Dosa, clearly, we know that people who are blind, Yaakov at the end of Yitzchak, his eyes become dim. Eli HaKohen, his eyes become fixed. He's not on the battlefield. He's back in the Mishkan waiting for word of what's happening. And here's another, we think, okay, he's in his twilight years. He can't come anymore. Einav kamo, milavo lebeit hamidrash. And they don't seem to have a direct relationship with him because he's gotten too old. He's no longer relevant. He's waiting out his years at home, but he's chacham gadol. So they have to address this. Amru, umi yelech v'yodio. Remember, I told you to remember that. Who's going to go inform him? Well, what are they informing him of? If I go back to my Tanur V'achnai story where we have the same exact phrase, oh, this suggests confrontation. This suggests some sort of excommunication, challenge, elimination of his position. So my story, as a reader, starting the story, it's very familiar to me. Oh, there's someone who is acting in accordance to Beit Shammai. That won't do. We act in accordance with Beit Hillel, and he's a Chacham Gadol, and we have to go inform him. So the story already seems familiar, and we're lulled into the story, and we're going to get slammed because the story is going to reveal for us how ignorant we are and how ignorant the sages are as to what's really happening. Amar lahen Rabbi Yoshua ni'elecha, player number one. Rabbi Yoshua, I'll go. Va'acharav me, the rabbis say, well, you really should take someone with you. Not a good idea to go alone. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, another big player, a young player from the world of the sages. Va'acharav me, Rabbi Akiva. This is the trifecta of sages of Yavne. We have Rabbi Yoshua, who would represent the elder, right? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, the younger, and now we have Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva is the heavy hitter. Rabbi Akiva is our hero. Rabbi Akiva is the one who mediates. Rabbi Akiva is the one who goes into these spaces and emerges triumphant in helping mitigate, navigate these tempestuous waters, tempestuous dynamics between the sages. So I have Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, and I know how this story is going to turn out. I am completely prepared for what this is going to look like. Now I happen to like this because again, here we don't really need this scene, but it's really just as a literary moment setting us up. They go and they stand on the threshold. It's amazing. The liminal space between they are marching in formation, ready to come and confront Rabbi Dosa, the elder, Rabbi Dosa, the blind. Maybe he's a little bit vulnerable in our mind, but nonetheless, they are going to get done what has to be done because he's Chacham Gadol, and they're standing at the entrance, and they have to be let in. Nichnasa shivchato, and now we have the maidservant. I will say there are other servants where the maidservant lets the men in, right? Not time. I mean, I think she, the feminine role, the role of the maidservant is an interesting role. I haven't done enough studying where the maidservant allows the sages in. I will say what comes to mind is the famous story with the Talmid Chacham who goes to the prostitute. He goes across the waters, 400 pieces of gold, and he gets to the threshold. And the maidservant has to tell the prostitute that he's here and allow him to cross the threshold. So I feel like I haven't seen anyone really explore that, but there are enough stories where the maidservant is the one who announces the men or allows them to cross the threshold, that I believe it's a deliberate device, right? This idea that they're standing al petach beito, nichnasa shivchato, amralo Rebbe, Chachmei Yisrael ba'in etzlecha. And so she announces them, Amarla yikansu, let them in, v'nichnasu. So Rabbi Dosa does not seem to have any idea that a battle is about to take place, a mortal battle in which he's about to lose. He's about to be informed of what their decision has been regarding his position in the world of Torah. He's not in the Beit Midrash anymore, but virtually. And he absolutely let them in. V'nichnesu. Okay. What happens? Tvasol Rabbi Yoshua, he's excited. He grabs a hold of Rabbi Yoshua. Vahu al mitashel zahav. He puts him on a bed of gold. Amarlo, Rebbe, and more the Talmidcha acher v'yeshev. I'm just paginating it so it's easier to read. So remember, he's blind, and he says, Rabbi Yoshua says to him, really, can you tell the student, Rebbe, right? He calls him my master, my Rebbe. Can you let the student who's coming in behind me sit down? He says, Amar lo mihu, Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Wow, okay, Amar. So first of all, they're coming in one by one. They speak to him deferentially, but we, of course, as readers know, this is not going to be deferential. They're coming, there's a coup. They're coming to confront him, right? This is not like we want to sit at your feet and learn from you. We're coming to let you know how wrong you are. Okay. So Rabbi Yoshua, and he
Nechama,
yeah.
if he was blind, and he asked Rabbi Yoshua, who's this other person, how did he know the first one was Rabbi Yoshua?
So that's a good question. I would say Rabbi Yoshua, as I said, is the oldest of the three. And it seems likely to me that Rabbi Yoshua is the one who he knows and he's met. And so smell, his footsteps, his voice, right? He knows the Chachamim are coming. And so it's familiar. He knows, he recognizes Rabbi Yoshua, right? It's what we've said. We had another story with Rabbi Yosef, who's blind, and Rabba bar Rabbi Yosef. And there too, Rav Yosef knows it's Rava. He says, "Oh, is that my student Rava? Is that Rava bar Rav Yosef?" So I think the idea is he recognizes Rabbi Yoshua, but he doesn't know who the others are. And he says, "Well, tell the guy after." And he says, "Well, who is it?" Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. V'yeshlo ben Azariah chaverenu. He knew his father, and he says, "Did Azariah have a son?" Now, what does this tell me? He's been away from the Beit Midrash for a long time. He's been distanced from the Beit Midrash for a long time. They've kept him away, or he's been kept, whatever it is. And what does he say? Kara alav hamikra hazeh nar hayiti begam zakanti v'lo ra'ayiti tzadik ne'azav v'zaro mavakesh lachem. And he says, this is wonderful. The fact that my friend Azariah left behind a son to study Torah, he's delighted. He rejoices. Tfasovo shivo al mitash al zahav. So now he grabs him and puts him also on a couch of gold. So he's treating them very, very well. Amarlo, Rebbe, and more the Talmidcha acher v'yeshev. There's another one. Can you tell the third guy, the other student? Amarlo mihu, Akiva ben Yosef. Amarlo atahu Akiva ben Yosef sheshimcha holech misof haolam v'ad sof. Again, he's never met him. He says, "I've heard your reputation. Wow, from one end of the world to the other." Shev b'ni, shev, kamotcha yirbu v'Yisrael. So Rabbi is delighted. He's not threatened in any way. He is not, we can say maybe he's a little bit of an innocent, right? He doesn't seem to understand what's about to unfold. And he treats them graciously and he treats them respectfully. And he is ready to, to listen to whatever it is that they are, they're going to bring to him. There are pleasantries here. He's delighted to see that the world of Torah is going to continue. Are we meant to think that he's a little bit of a doddering old man, that like he's, acting in an innocent way? Oh, Azariah's son has grown up, and Akiva. Well, do you not think it's odd that three sages have shown up, right? Three, it's like a beit din, right? You're not suspicious in any way, but he graciously welcomes them. He does not recognize that they're adversaries. We know that they're coming to challenge him. Okay, let's see what happens next. So to me, this is the hekifuhu dvarim ka'achnai, right? They begin to encircle him. Oh, to me, this is exactly what happened to Eliezer ben Harkanas, right? They encircle him. They are circling him with halachot. They know exactly where they're going. So they don't immediately get to Tzarat Habat, right? They don't get to the rival wife. but they encircle and encircle and encircle, right? They go, this argument and this argument, and they finally get to what they've come to confront. Sarat habat mahu. What do you have to say about the rival wife of the daughter? Amar lehem machloket Beit Shammai u'Beit Hillel. It's machloket Beit Shammai u'Beit Hillel. Halacha k'divrei mi. Amar lehem halacha k'Beit Hillel. It's like this enormous collapse. Like what? Wait. we as readers are a little surprised. Wait, where's the climax? This was supposed to be the big showdown, and they've now basically said, he's basically said to them what he's supposed to say. Halacha k'Beit Hillel, and they didn't even have to argue with him, right? He's like, what do you mean, halacha k'Beit Hillel? Amru lo v'halo mishimcha amru halacha k'Beit Shammai. Don't they quote you in the name of Beit Shammai? He said to them, Amar lehem, dosa shamatem? Did you hear dosa? O ben Hyrcanus shamatem. Did you hear it in my name? Maybe you heard Ben Hyrcanus. We're going to find out in a minute why that's significant. Amaru lo chaye Rebbe stam shamanu. Actually, we only heard it anonymously, right? It's like there's sudden silence. Like I've done it like there's this, all the like, who do you rule like? Well, I rule like Beit Hillel. Oh. Well, we heard you ruled like Beit Shammai. Did you actually ever hear dosa? Actually, we never heard your name at all. Right? So what's happened here is the antithesis, right? Like the sages suddenly look very foolish. Not just foolish. There's something wrong, right? Wait a minute. The tension of the story has completely shifted from this righteous indignation, this righteous war that's being waged to take back the Beit Hillel camp and like excommunicate the Beit Shammai and like righteousness will be restored. And they show up at what seems to be a doddering old man who's been distanced from the Beit Midrash for quite a long time. And they're encircling him, misavavino to b'halachot. And now they get to their point and it evaporates. Like they're completely wrong. Everything they came to confront has now shifted and they're just wrong. And there's something that we're meant to understand. There's a critique here about their whole approach. And they're waiting. Is he going to resist? Is he going to acquiesce? And in the end, there's there's anticlimax. Like what just happened, right? They've completely misread the situation. And so they are, okay, we're going to go on to the next scene. So now we're going to find out the whole plot was driven by a misunderstanding. I just want to make sure I'm not missing something. No, give me a minute. Okay. So now we're getting into the big reveal, right? Why did they even think? What's the possibility? Why did they think it was dosa? So what does he say to them? And this is the part, now remember, we're talking about brothers. Okay. Amar lahem, ach katan yeshli. I actually have a younger brother who's also Ben Hyrcanus. Bechor Satanhu, who is the firstborn of the Satan. We don't have this anywhere else in the Talmud. It appears a little bit in the New Testament. V'Yonatan Shmo. His name is Yonatan. V'humi Talmidei Shammai. And he's of the disciples of Shammai. Okay, so now everything's shifted. This doddering old man is not so doddering because he begins to reveal to them the source of their ignorance, and you know, really check your facts before you go to confront someone. And now he says to them, and you better be careful with him because he's a master of dialect. Now, what's interesting here is they think they're the masters of dialect, of dialectical arguments. And they are coming to champion Beit Hillel over Beit Shammai using dialectical arguments. Remember, misovavino to b'halachot, they've been engaged in this dialectical framework of halacha after halacha. And now he says to them, first of all, you're wrong. It wasn't me. I know the rule follows Beit Hillel. Second of all, I have a brother and he's a master of the dialectical. So if you're going to engage with him, you better understand Lefi sheyesh imo shlosh meot tshuvot b'tzarat habat she'i muteret. He can prove you 300 ways that the rival wife of a daughter is permitted. Aval me'idan, but me, I don't go for the dialectical. Like, I don't know why you guys are like even trying. Me'id ani elai shamayim ba'aretz. First of all, he's invoking shamayim ba'aretz. Moshe invokes shamayim ba'aretz at the end of his life, heaven and earth. Sha'al midocha zo yashav Chagai hanavi. That on this mortar, on this stool, Chagai the Navi, which is really the end also, he lived during Bayit Sheni. He sat, va'amar shlosha dvarim, but of course, prophecy ended a long time ago. And the Goanim are going to try to say, did he really sit before Dosa, or is Dosa just saying, I got to keep the stool that Chagai sat on, right? I preserved the stool. Va'amar shlosha dvarim, sarat habat asura, Amon o Moab ma'asrin ma'aser ani b'shvi'it. We've talked about that argument as well. Umekablim gerin min hakrodoyin o min hatarmudim. Okay. He says, I don't know what you guys are going on about in Yavna, but I have a tradition from Chagai. And by the way, all of Beit Hillel, he believed in tradition. Now, I'm about to show you how ironic this is. Remember, Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is a bor si shalom abei tipa. He's the one who holds on to every tradition he's ever received from his elders. And they excommunicate him because they say you have to get ready for dialectical arguments in the manner of Rabbi Akiva. They now show up at Dosa ben Hyrcanus prepared to go to battle with dialectical arguments, and he shuts them down by saying, I don't know what you guys are arguing about. Like, I have a tradition from Hillel, but really it's from Chagai Hanavi, who said Sarat Habat Asura. Like, there's nothing to really argue about here. Like, and by the way, if you meet my brother, he's the master of the dialectical. Like, your whole approach, he like can best you at it. And he'll prove to you that the Sarat Habat is muteret. But who really cares? The Sarat Habat is Asura, because I have that from Chagai Hanavi, right? Notice the irony here. It's irony in contrast to the Tanur of Achdai, and it's irony in that they think they know best because of this whole world of Yavna rests on dialectical arguments. That's who Rabbi Akiva is. That's what the world of that Beit Midrash is. And he's like, oh, the dialectical? You mean the one that Shammai perfected and my brother is the master of? No, I don't do that. Like, I don't go in for that. I go for tradition, and I have a tradition from Chagai, and that's why I do this, right? And then the second point about Ammon and Moab, they take the tithe, they take the poor man's tithe in the sabbatical year because that land doesn't have Kedushat Shvit. It was an argument we saw last year, also involving Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. And then you accept converts from the Karduyan and the Talmudian families. You don't have to worry about Mamzerim, Lo Mishaneh, right? I'm not interested in those two pieces right now. But it's fascinating, right? The story really should end there. Moshe Shoshan shows in the manner, I'm going to have to pause in a minute. We're going to pick up with Act 3 next week. I'm going to stop here just to summarize. I'm not going to rush Act 3. But essentially what's happened, if we end it right here, is just brilliant storytelling. Because the sages have been critiqued harshly, right? They come to this old man, they think he has no value to them. Not only that, they think he's on the wrong side of the camp, right? He's a Shammaiist. He has to be shut down. He has to be, taught a lesson. And in the end, their tails are between their legs, so to speak, right? They've been exposed for I would say what often happens in the world in these critical stories. There's arrogance, there's ego, there's a surety of like, we hold the Torah, right? Lo b'shamayim, and we're like going forward with that. And in that last line, he basically says to them, yeah, what are you doing? Like, I have it from Chagai. Go argue with my brother, but be careful because you're probably going to lose. And then you're going to be back in this between Shammai and Hillel. You're going to be confused. You're not going to know what to do. Don't be confused, right? There's a place for tradition. There's a place for passing down tradition. And Rabbi Dosa is now the hero. He's no less than the hero. First of all, he's been kind. He's been pleasant. He's accepted them. He hasn't been threatened by them. And he's very almost gently put them in their place by saying, like, when they're ready with this confrontation, he's like, no, I follow Beit Hillel. And they're like, well, we thought da-da-da. No, it's not me. Like, maybe it's my brother, but I follow Chagai, right, the prophet. And so Dosa really at this point has kind of taken back some of what was lost in the Eliezer ben Hyrcanus story, which is don't become too extreme in any way. Dialectical only gets you so far. You can't lose tradition. And not only that, Dosa, who is really very humble and who really is grateful to them for continuing the world of Torah, he's not threatened. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was an anti-hero. He was an anti-hero because he could not find a way to work with the sages. He could not see anything except his own camp, right? And as a result, he can't really work in the world of Beit Midrash. Rabbi Dosa is entirely different. He's delighted that his friend Azariah has a son. He's delighted that Akiva is conquering the world of Torah with his great acuity and his great acumen and dialectical. But he also very gently reminds them that that only gets you so far, right? You also have to have an anchoring in passing on of tradition. And so we're going to continue. The story is going to get interesting. We're going to meet his brother, right? That's going to be a really fascinating moment where we actually meet his brother, and we're going to see where that goes. So any comments or questions? Hi, Shira.
Yes, I have a question. Was
Yeah.
Hyrcanus just a very common family
Yeah.
name, or
Yeah.
was, I
Yeah.
mean, was there
Not
any
the same
relationship
family. It's
between
not- I
Dosa
haven't
and
seen anyone.
Eliezer?
Right. No, I haven't seen anyone who says there's a connection.
Okay,
They're actually spelled in English. It's interesting. They spell it differently. Hyrcanus with an A versus Hyrcanus with, I think, an O. But I don't know if that's because in the Greek it would have been. I don't know. But
Okay.
I've read articles about both of them, and I haven't seen anyone suggest they're related. It could just be it was a common name of maybe Hellenized families, right? We said
Okay.
Hyrcanus, my son who went off the derech. I do think there's a Greek element to the name, so it might just reflect like Cohen, a fairly common name at that time, maybe for Hellenized families, but I can't back that up. I know with Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, it does suggest that his father Hellenized and he came back, and we saw stories that supported that, but I haven't seen that with Dosa ben Hyrcanus.
It was Hyrcanus also amongst the Hashmonaim.
Yes.
okay.
Yeah, it seems to
And
be.
sometimes it's spelt with a Y.
Yes, it is sometimes spelled with a
Yeah,
Y.
That's
Hyrcanus.
right. I have a question.
Yes.
This is just technical. I'm at Matan and they printed me out the
Source sheet.
the pages, whatever. Anyway, and on this stuff that you're doing now, this whole story, I only have it here in
In
English.
Yes,
So-
I can send you, I reworked it after I sent it, and I knew I was
Ah.
going to share my screen. So I'm happy to send it to you, Donna, this one.
Okay, because you're reading the Hebrew and I'm thinking, wait a minute, where is this? Okay,
It was
If you
on the
could-
screen. Yeah.
if you could send
Yeah,
it to
maybe
me.
send it to everybody.
I'll
Maybe
send
you
it back to
send it.
the office
Yeah.
to tell them to send it
Thank
out.
you so much. Really
Thank you.
enjoyable.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Shabbat
guys.
shalom.